Our guest for this week is Dr. Steve Forman of City of Hope. We're sitting here in his office. Thank you for your time today, Dr. Forman.
You're very welcome.
We're here today to learn about the process a little bit of what is bone marrow, what types of things lead to needing a transplant, the process, and why this donor database is important. So what is bone marrow and what is its function in the body?
So bone marrow is inside the bones of our skeleton, and that is where the blood is made. The blood is made up of several components: white cells that fight infection, red blood cells that carry oxygen and give us energy, and platelets to clot the blood. And it's also an important part of the immune system, cells that we have. So it's a vital organ. Most people don't think of inside the marrow as an organ, but it is, and it produces all of those things that keep us alive hour to hour.
Is that different from stem cells, or are stem cells in there somewhere?
So inside the marrow, there's lots of cells inside the marrow, but at the heart of it, at the origin, are a few cells that are called stem cells that make everything else. So from one cell becomes many. And it populates the marrow and it populates the blood. And when you go to your doctor and he gets a blood count and says it's normal, it's because those stem cells inside that person's bone marrow has been cranking out those cells, minute after minute for many years.
Now, what conditions can create a need to replace the bone marrow that you already have?
So most of the diseases for which we do transplants are diseases that originate in the bone marrow. So there is leukemia, there is lymphoma, there is myeloma, there's myelodysplasia, myeloproliferative disorders. These are all cancers of the bone marrow. In the same way a woman can get breast cancer in her breast, or people can get colon cancer in the colon, people can get cancer in the bone marrow. And leukemia is the one that people know best. And one of the ways to try to get rid of it is to replace the whole bone marrow organ through an organ transplant with somebody else's stem cells that aren't diseased and are healthy.
Now, if somebody needs to replace the bone marrow, would anyone's bone marrow work, or do we need to be more specific than that?
So when we do transplants where it requires somebody else's, we do matching testing to try to find the ideal donor. We first look in the family and see if a brother or sister is a good match. And depending upon how many brothers and sisters you have, your odds of matching go up. And we inherit sets of genes from each parent, and we're looking for which child or which person inherited the same set of genes as the person who's afflicted with the disease. If we don't find a match in the family, we go into what's called the international registries. The Be the Match program being the best known in the United States, where people, out of the goodness of their heart and wanting to do good in the world, have volunteered to have their blood typed so that we can see whether somebody in New Hampshire matches somebody here at the City of Hope who needs a transplant. And if they do match in our testing, we ask them to donate stem cells so that we can hopefully cure our patient of their bone marrow cancer.
Assuming no family member, no sibling, what is the success rate that we tend to see in finding a match in that international registry of various databases?
So when these databases of volunteer people was started a good 20 years ago or more, it was really just a few thousand people. And so the odds of finding a match were really pretty remote. And as the registry got larger, we began to see the power of the size of the registry, where we were able to find more matches for more of our patients. You can imagine the anxiety of a patient who has got a life-threatening disease, who is waiting to find out, is there a match any place for them? And so we rely in large part on these registries of people who don't know our patient, but yet are motivated by some inner goodwill to be available in case the need should arise. What we've seen is that the larger the registry has gotten, the more likely it is we can find a donor. It's not a static thing, though. People age out, people get sick and can't be a donor, so there's always a need to expand the registry to keep it vibrant and large, hoping to be able to find a donor for anybody who might need it. What we found, however, was that different ethnicities are underrepresented in the registry. And so in addition to the global effort of expanding the size of the registry, there are focuses that we do in trying to expand certain ethnicities and nationalities in the registry so that everybody might have the opportunity to get a transplant to cure their disease who might need it.
So if you have a person here at City of Hope whose ancestry, and it could be they moved here from another country or their parents did more recently, someone from that area, that region of the world might be more likely to be a match. Would that be somewhat accurate?
Somewhat accurate. So we have people of a different a person here of a unique ethnicity. We might try to look in the registries that are in that part of the world. But I wish it was that simple. But we do a lot of our donor drives are very focused in various communities. So we'll go in to the Asian community, we'll go into the Orthodox Jewish community, we'll go into the Hispanic, African American, trying to expand those populations. And we have definitely seen the power of the size of the registry translate into matches being found for someone and therefore a life saved, because absent that donation, absent identifying that person who is willing to give stem cells, our patient wouldn't survive.
Now, what needs to match? When you say we're trying to find a match, what actually needs to match?
So what we do, we're looking at certain what are called antigens that are on the surface of all the cells of our body. They call them transplantation antigens, but they're really part of the immune response and how our body responds to infections in the world. But as I said before, we get two sets of those genes, one from our mom and one from our dad. And so when we see families come to us with large numbers of children, we are reasonably confident we're going to find a match for that person just by the family size. But family sizes are getting smaller, and in certain parts of the world they're very small. And so we can't always rely on that. So I think you get the point this way. Of the 600 odd transplants that we do at the City of Hope per year approximately, if you compared family member donation to unrelated donor, this is twice as many. So in some sense, the patient who has an unrelated donor has a much larger family that has come through for them than sometimes the small families or only children, things of that nature.
As if only children need enough of a disadvantage. But
that's right.
I won't go there for this evening.
Okay.
Now, we found a match. What is the process for the donor of the bone marrow, of the cells, of the blood? What will the donor be called upon to do?
So once we say to the donor center, which are all over the United States, that this donor whose blood we confirmed as a match is who we would like to donate for our patient, that person is called in and it's explained to them what's involved. And there are really two choices. One is to actually take them to the operating room and under a very short procedure just extract marrow from the hip bones. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes. And that person is sore for a few days from the needles, but recovers completely and there's no lingering long-term side effects of that. And that's in fact how we did all marrow transplants over the years in the early days. What was discovered, however, was that these stem cells that were in the bone marrow that we were trying to extract to put into the patient also circulate in the bloodstream. And there's a drug we give that helps push these stem cells from inside the bone marrow into the bloodstream, so we can then collect the blood and do the transplant utilizing stem cells that are in the bloodstream there. And most transplants are done that way now because it doesn't involve any anesthesia. Operating room, you go on a machine where a needle is put in an arm here and a needle there, and blood comes out into a machine, it takes the cells we want and puts what we don't want back in, and it takes about 4 hours. And then you get unhooked and you walk out feeling appropriately good about what you did.
And again, there'd be no reason for there to be any lingering side effects of that.
And there aren't.
And the stem cells that you spoke of, the rest of them that are still in your body are busy replacing what has been donated.
So that's a very good point, that when we do either the marrow extraction or the peripheral blood utilizing the machine, the body makes everything we took back in hours. So it's not like it is an organ transplant, but it's not like any other organ transplant where you're missing a kidney, part of a lung, part of a liver. Those are living donor. The bone marrow grows back. And under many circumstances, the donor, if everything goes well, at some point in time, usually a year or more, will have the opportunity to meet the person whose life they saved. And even though I've been doing this for a long time, those moments that we get to witness are no less inspiring or breathtaking than it was the very first time we saw it.
How close, if this is even a way to phrase it, how close a match do you need to have between the donor and the recipient when it's a non-family? Because it seems like getting many of the same genes from the same parents would naturally, I would expect there to be a closer match of however many factors there are. How close a match do you need to get?
We try to get as close a match as we can. The better the match, the better the outcome. Although we're working on ways, we've seen studies that have suggested we can get away with less than perfect match. And the more of that we do, the less stringent we have to be. And sometimes have to make the decision, well, we'll accept a less than perfect match because we got a patient who isn't going to be around long enough to wait a year to find a donor. And so a lot of the work that we do is to figure out how to make sure there's a donor for everyone. And I think we're going to get to that point in the next few years, from what I've seen so far.
Does the age of the donor matter?
So the way the registry works right now, and this has changed over the years, they have been requesting that the age be lower and lower. It used to be, older people, grandparents, but I think they are looking for people who are certainly healthy and are going to be in the registry for a while. So if you're 67 years old and going to the registry, that's going to be a short-term place. So they're looking, the ideal place is where we go to college campuses and occasions like that, hoping those are people who will stay in the registry. And we've seen examples of people who were in the registry for 5, 6, 7 years before they got called. They actually had probably forgotten that they're in the registry until they got the call. But in our experience, once they get called, and if they say, yes, I'll give you that sample to confirm that I'm a match, if we need them, generally they say yes.
Now, what's the process now that we found the match for the recipient? What will your patient here then be going through once we have the match and we bring in what we need from the donor?
So our task with the patient is really twofold. The first is that person has a cancer that we need to get rid of it. So they undergo some degree of chemotherapy or radiation or both to try to kill off the cancer. But we also have to prepare the patient to accept an organ, stem cells from somebody else, and not reject them. So the strategy is really twofold. Get rid of the cancer, and in the process you end up getting rid of their own bone marrow, sometimes worthless as it might be, and then replacing it with somebody else's. And we want to be sure that our patient accepts that, and that those stem cells can find their way into the spots in the bone marrow and begin to make blood and platelets and white cells as it did before, the only difference being that these cells have the genes of the donor. And the best example for the people who are listening to this to understand the difference, if we transplant stem cells from a woman into a man, then his blood will be all female for the rest of his life. And the flip is also the case, that if we transplant male cells into a female, her blood and immune system will be male for the rest of her life. And that just shows you that these stem cells came from somebody else, are now part of this other person's body. And so sometimes we have 50, 60-year-old, 70-year-old people who've gotten transplants who have blood that's the blood of a 21-year-old. And I know a lot of people like that, and it's an interesting experience for them. Or if we transplant somebody whose blood type is O with somebody whose stem cells make A-type red cells, we will flip the blood type to be something else over the course of the life. And that just shows you that it's real. It's not their stem cells anymore, it's somebody else's.
And that was actually the sound of a blood type changing.
That's right there.
Interesting, I like that. It comes with its own sound effect.
It does.
So now, how long a process is it typically? I know every patient must be unique and individual. How long a process would it be from the point where you actually put the first of the donor's product into the recipient? How much time do we need to know that this has worked? How much time before the patient is feeling back up to close to normal?
So there's different clocks. And since this is about unrelated donor transplants, some people start the clock of when the first request goes in to find the donor, because we're waiting, patient's waiting, family's waiting, and waiting is another way of saying worrying. So the first step is to find the donor, but it's only the very first step. Then when they come in for transplant, we do all the radiation and chemotherapy that's required to get them ready. But the day of the transplant, when the stem cells are infused, is day 0, and we count from there. So if you ask the question, well, how long does it take before you can see cells growing in that person that are from the donor, it's about 2 weeks. The counts go down to 0, and we have to support that person through sometimes a very tumultuous and adventuresome few weeks to keep them going until the cells engraft. And once they engraft, they usually produce counts fairly well. Then there's this period of watching to see how well do these new cells, this new immune system, behave inside that person, and it varies, and we give them medicines like any organ transplant recipient to keep things relatively quiet. But as I say to my staff, that's only the first step. The patient came here didn't just get a transplant to flip their blood, they came here to get cured of their cancer. And so another clock is, well, how long? That's a question the patient always asks. Well, how do you know when I'm cured? It's not on the first week, it's not in the second week. It takes about a year or two to get a more confident feeling that the reason you did the transplant was realized, namely to have this person go on with their life on their terms and not the terms of their disease, with increasingly less fear that the disease may come crawling back. So for most of our patients, if they get past 2 or 3 years and they have gotten over all the stuff that happens in a transplant and the disease is still gone, the odds are heavily in their favor that that it becomes part of their past history and not part of their future fear.
So, because we're focusing our attention while learning about the process, we're focusing on attention on what we can do about bone marrow transplants, what we out here can do to help. Mm-hmm. What would you most like us to know about the importance of being a willing bone marrow donor and how to expand your options as a doctor of finding a match?
Most of the donors that we have in the registry joined because somebody was sick that they knew or had heard about, or a plea went out. I think everybody recognizes that on any given day, and I include myself in this statement. That could be me in that bed. That could be my closest friend. That could be a relative. So it's very personal what we do. Particularly when you see that people all over the world are somehow getting beyond geography, religion, politics, ethnicity, to try to help somebody they've never met, it emphasizes the large human community that this represents. We're all part of that, and I think the way people can help is to join the registry, and they can do blood donations, because it takes a lot of blood transfusions to get a patient through transplant until their stem cells are making it on their own. And in fact, the registry in many ways was an outgrowth of the whole transfusion community, platelets and red cells. So the best way people can help us continue with this work, can help their fellow man, fellow woman, fellow child, is to join the registry, and maybe you'll be honored to be chosen one day. We have, in fact, I was just in the paper the other day, a woman we transplanted with a very rare disease, whose brother was the donor. But her son was watching all this go on, and he thought, maybe the thing I can do is just join the registry. And lo and behold, 2 years later, he got called, and he donated here for somebody in another country. So it just emphasizes the ways in which we are all, in large ways and small ways, tied together more than you might realize moment to moment in life.
Dr. C. Forman, we'll have your bio on the website, but doctor here at City of Hope, and most importantly to our Rotary Club, the doctor who took care of our member, Roy Glickman. Thank you very much for your time today, and we'll get to work building your database for you.
Thank you very much.